Hello class, this is our lecture on roots and soil. Let's get started. Our outline is as follows. We're going to learn all things roots today, including function, development, structure. We'll learn about some specialized roots, and we'll learn about some relationships, some really important ecological, symbiotic relationships between roots and other types of organisms. Finally, we'll say a few words about soils. So what are the functions of the root? Well, number one, they anchor the plant in the soil. Related to that, number two, they absorb water and mineral salts from the soil because plants need water and substances dissolved in that water in order to do their metabolism. Three, roots store food and or water depending on the type of root. And finally, four, roots serve as a passageway in which substances can move from the outside environment to different places inside that plant. Roots develop as seeds grow, and the embryo's radicle is the thing that grows out of that seed and develops into the first root. Now, depending on the evolutionary group of plants that we're talking about, this is slightly different. In monocots, this radicle, which remember that's just the part of the embryo that grows into the roots, will develop into adventitious or fibrous root systems. And in the dicot group of plants, that radicle will grow into a thick taproot with branch roots coming out the side. Root structure is as follows, broken down into four regions, and we'll go through these four regions one by one. First is the root cap, second is the region of cell division, third is the region of cell elongation, and fourth is the region of maturation. First, the root cap, which is a thimble-shaped mass of parenchyma cells that covers the root tip. This is a group of cells that's very important because it protects the meristem that is found just underneath it. As the root grows, it sacrifices some of these parenchyma cells so that that very important meristem doesn't get damaged. Some other functions of the root cap includes it secretes a mucus that acts as a lubricant to help those little roots grow through the rocks and dirt in the soil. And another function of the root cap is it functions in gravitropism, which is the fancy word for gravity perception. We'll learn more about gravity perception once we do our plant growth lecture later in the semester. Just inside of the root cap is our second part of the root, which is the region of cell division. This is composed of an apical meristem in the center of the root tip. And just like all meristems, this is divided into three regions that give rise to tissues as the root matures. We're going to find the protoderm, which gives rise to the epidermis, the ground meristem, which gives rise to the cortex and pith regions, and the procambium, which gives rise to the primary xylem and the primary phloem. Our third region is the region of elongation, and this is where the cells start to stretch out as the root is growing, and we often see the vacuoles of these long cells start to merge. Finally, number four is the region of maturation, in which the cells finally differentiate into their distinctive cell types. We find root hairs, which are epidermal cell extensions with a very thin cuticle. It's important that it has a thin cuticle because we're talking about water absorption, so we don't want a thick waxy layer blocking that water. The root hairs serve to absorb water and minerals, therefore, and also to stick to the soil particles to really help anchor that plant into the ground. Root hairs are very important because they simply increase the total absorptive surface of a root, greatly enhancing the surface to volume ratio. In this diagram, it shows us how a root hair grows out of a single epidermal cell and into the soil. Now, as those root hairs grow into the soil and absorb water, This water can actually take two pathways into the cell. It can move by the apoplast path of water or the symplast path of water. The apoplast path of water means that water absorbs into the cell wall and then it continues moving through cell walls and intercellular spaces. The symplast path of water means that water goes all the way into the protoplast, where it's moving through the cells, through the cytoplasm of interconnected cells, through the plasmodesmata, until eventually it makes it all the way into the tracheary elements found in the center of the root. Now notice the apoplast path of water does not allow the water to pass all the way into the tracheary elements, because the apoplast path of water gets blocked by a waxy layer found inside the endodermis, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So what is this region called cortex? Well, it's simply where we find parenchyma cells between the epidermis and the vascular cylinder. And the cortex includes the endodermis as part of this region. The cortex is situated inside of the epidermis, but outside of the vascular cylinder. The primary function of the cortex region is to store food for these plants. The endodermis is considered to be the inner boundary of the cortex. And look at that root word, endo. Endo means within. So we are within the epidermis, but outside of the vascular cylinder. The endodermis consists of typically just a single layered cylinder of compact cells. And some of those cells have suberin that is impregnated on the cell walls. And the suberin is a waxy layer that ends up providing a waterproofness. It forces water and dissolved substances entering and leaving the central core to pass through the endodermis symplastically. And that's important because once that water gets into the vascular cylinder, there's really no controlling it anymore. By transpiration, it's simply going to move rapidly through the plant. So by having this endodermis with this Casparian strip found inside of it, it's going to allow for regulation of the minerals absorbed. The vascular cylinder is found just inside the endodermis. It's the core of the tissues found inside the endodermis, and it includes the pericycle. That pericycle is a ring of cells just inside of the endodermis, but the outer boundary of the vascular cylinder. The pericycle is very important because it retains some meristematic qualities. That is to say, it continues to divide even after mature, which can allow for the formation of things such as branch roots, which are lateral roots that grow out from the pericycle and push their way out into the cortex and eventually through the epidermis. Most of the cells of the vascular cylinder are made up of primary xylem or primary phloem. We don't typically see any secondary growth in the center of our vascular cylinders. However, there is a distinction that we can see. First, dicots or conifer roots tend to have a solid core of xylem with little arms in cross-section view. It almost looks like an X of xylem found in the center of that vascular cylinder. The phloem is found in little patches between the xylem arms. Now later in development, occasionally a vascular cambium will form from the pericycle, which is going to be secondary phloem produced to the outside and secondary xylem produced to the inside. So in this instance, we will start to see secondary growth occurring inside our root. These diagrams show us a comparison of dicot versus monocot roots. And the main thing to notice is that those monocot roots don't have that X of xylem in the center of the vascular cylinder. Instead, those monocot roots have a ring of that xylem found in the vascular cylinder. So here's a fun fact. In Utah of the United States, there are some root-cloned trees that are growing by root cloning, which means they can live for a very long time. Some of the trees on this clone are estimated to be 80,000 years old, and these are all trees that belong to the group of plants called the quaking aspens. Now let's take a look at the specialized roots. These are going to be some very unique roots that provide special functions in different plant groups. Some plants produce food storage roots, in which they store things like sugars or other carbohydrates in the root. For example, a sweet potato is a type of modified root tuber, and a carrot is a taproot. Now, while a sweet potato is a root, we're going to learn that regular potatoes, such as white potatoes or red-skin potatoes, those are actually stems. So hopefully that doesn't confuse you too much. Next, we've got water storage roots. Some different types of plants store tons of water in a big underground root. Next, we've got propagative roots. This is going to be similar to what we saw with the quaking aspen and those root clones. This is where adventitious buds develop into suckers, and we can see clones of the parent tree growing off of the roots. A common fruit tree, such as plums or cherries, often produce these suckers. Our next specialized root is a pneumatophore. These are found in different types of trees that often grow in very waterlogged soils. By having roots that grow above ground, it allows for gas exchange so that the trees don't choke to death on too much water. Because while trees need water, too much water does not allow them to breathe. Our next specialized root is aerial roots. Many types of orchids and other types of plants that grow on the side of trees use their roots to attach to the side of a tree. Now, the fancy word for an organism that grows on the side of something else is an epiphyte. The root word epi means upon, and phyte means plant. So orchids, some types of orchids, are epiphytes because they grow on the sides of trees. And it's these aerial roots that allow them to stay attached. Next up is contractile roots. These are specialized roots that allow some plants to pull themselves deeper in the soil. This is a nice strategy if you're in a seasonal drought. If it's very hot and dry, then you can pull yourself slightly underground to protect your water. How do they do this? Well, in the roots, the cells shrink vertically and expand radially to pull the stem and leaves deeper into the ground during this drought. Next up is a buttress root. These provide stability in tropical trees. In tropical systems, again, remember there's lots of waterlogged soils. There's big storms with lots of rain and wind. So this buttress roots helps keep these trees from falling over when there's a big storm. Next up is parasitic roots. We find these in lots of different plants that are going to be stealing their sugars from other types of organisms. Now, plants that have parasitic roots typically have no chlorophyll and can't do photosynthesis. So therefore they must steal their sugars from green plants growing around them. And the picture on the screen shows us a picture of one of these parasitic plants, and it has its special adventitious roots that are growing into the host plant and stealing their nutrients. And the name for the structure that steals those nutrients is called the haustoria. In this picture, it shows us a dissection of a tropical mistletoe, which is also a parasitic plant. And we can see the haustoria are completely penetrating the host twig. We can barely even see where the mistletoe ends and the host twig begins. Interestingly, we've learned that some types of mistletoes actually lack key genes that are involved in energy production. And this is very strange when you first think about it, because if you can't make your own energy, that would be an evolutionary dead end. You'd think you would die. It's almost like a de-evolution, we might say. However, because of this very important parasitic relationships, the mistletoes do survive over thousands of years. Now we'll look at some very specific relationships. The first is called a mycorrhizal relationship. Mycorrhizae are fungus relationships with plant roots, and it's considered to be mutualistic because both the fungus and the plant benefit. The fungus is able to absorb and concentrate nutrients much better than can be absorbed by root hairs alone. The overall benefit is by having these fungal threads growing in and around the roots, it greatly increases the surface to volume ratio. The plant benefits, the fungus benefits, both members of the relationship are happy. In fact, it's such a good relationship that mycorrhizae are found in over 80% of plant species worldwide. Root nodules is different. This is where the plants have bacterial colonies living on their roots. The bacteria do the job of producing enzymes that convert nitrogen into nitrates, and these nitrates can then be used by plants to do their metabolism. Now, without these nodules, much of the atmospheric nitrogen in the atmosphere would be lost to plants. But by having these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, it allows the plants to use this very important nitrogen to grow successfully. The legume family, which is called the Fabaceae, is one of the world's largest plant families, and many of them are able to do this nitrogen fixation by root nodules. Finally, a few words about soils. Soils are formed through the interaction of climate, parent material, topography, vegetation, and living organisms. That is to say, soils are dynamic. It's not just some dirt on the ground. There are lots of different components, including rocks, sand, clay, water, and living things, all found inside this soil. Now, plants need to breathe, so these pore spaces fill with both air and water as the roots grow in and among the soil. Soil is divided into different soil horizons, and some roots can grow into deeper soil horizons than others. Remember, the main job of roots is to stabilize the plant, and in doing so, they also stabilize the soils. Climate is the number one thing that shapes how soils form. Now, deserts, including the deserts of California, experience very little weathering due to low rainfall. Because of this, desert soils are very low in organic matter because of this low access to water. Grasslands have lots of moisture and therefore have layered root systems with a high availability of nutrients. Rainforests actually get too much water. There's so much rain in rainforests that it actually flushes a lot of nutrients out of the soil. We end up having a nice top layer of soil in a rainforest and then very nutrient-poor soils deep underneath. Therefore, lots of rainforest plants have relatively shallow roots that allows them to maximize nutrient absorption. Soils, as I mentioned, aren't just rocks and dirt. There's living things as well. There's an organic composition to all good soils. Bacteria and fungi are very important. They make up fairly large percentage of our total soil weight. And the word for good soil that's rich with organic matter is called humus. And the spelling is different. This isn't the hummus made from garbanzo beans that we put on our chips. This is a rich, partially decomposed organic matter that's found in a good soil. Now, sometimes soils do get out of balance and their pH gets affected. Now, if a soil gets too basic or too acidic, we can add chemicals to the soil to help balance it out. So basic or alkaline soils can be balanced by adding nitrogen, and acidic soils can be balanced by adding calcium or magnesium. But it's all about balance, right? Too much of a good thing can cause problems. And sometimes if we add too much nitrogen to our soil, for example, that nitrogen can run off the land and pollute waterways. So it's very important to do this soil pH adjustment in a responsible way. All right, so now we've talked all things roots. In review, we've talked about the functions, development, and structure. We looked at a short list of specialized root types, and then we learned about these relationships, the mycorrhizae and the root nodules. Lastly, we talked about the importance of soil, and hopefully now you have a great understanding of the roots. As always, please email me with any questions, and thank you for listening.